Sergeant James Carter had spent the better part of his career stationed at remote military bases, often in places far removed from the comforts of civilization. But none of those postings had prepared him for the eerie solitude of this particular base. Nestled on the border of a dense forest that seemed to swallow up the land, the air here was thick with fog every morning, and as the day broke, it often felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Carter had grown accustomed to the strange quiet that enveloped the forest at dawn. But this morning felt different. Something was off. He stood outside the barracks, staring at the thickening mist that blanketed the forest floor, and adjusted the straps on his gear. His breath rose in the cool morning air, and the silence seemed to press down on him. Normally, at this hour, the forest would be alive with the sounds of birds, small creatures rustling through the underbrush, and the distant calls of deer. But today, there was nothing. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, not even the wind moving through the trees. Just an unsettling quiet that made his senses tingle. Carter had seen combat in foreign lands, endured months of grueling patrols, and faced danger head-on. But this silence, the kind that made his skin crawl, was new. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at him. It was just a foggy morning, he told himself. A little too much time spent out here on the edge of nowhere. His patrol route was the same as always. Walk the perimeter of the base, keep an eye out for anything unusual, and return before the fog grew too thick to see. Easy, routine. But as he started walking into the forest, a nagging feeling clung to him, refusing to let go. The path was familiar. He'd walked it countless times before. The tall trees loomed overhead, their trunks thick and dark, their branches swaying slightly with the light breeze. The path beneath his boots was soft and uneven, but there were no surprises, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that's what he thought at first. As he moved deeper into the woods, Carter's sharp eyes caught something unusual. The ground was torn up. The earth churned in places where there shouldn't be any disturbance. His boots crunched over broken twigs and branches that had been snapped as if by force. Not natural wear. That wasn't normal. Carter crouched down and examined the tracks in the mud. They were fresh, but they didn't look like anything he had ever seen around here. They were large, almost too large, and the way the mud had been displaced suggested something heavy had passed through recently. His instincts, honed through years of service, flared up. Something wasn't right. He straightened up, scanning the trees around him, listening for any sound that might tell him more. Still nothing. The quiet was overwhelming. His hand instinctively went to the radio clipped to his chest. But before he could bring it to his mouth, a faint sound reached his ears. It was a low rustling, the faintest crack of a branch in the distance. He froze, all senses alert. Carter stood still, straining to hear more, but the sound didn't come again. The silence returned, suffocating and thick. He turned back to the path ahead, his mind racing. His mission was clear: patrol the area, make sure everything was secure, and report anything unusual. But this felt different. It wasn't just the strange signs of disturbance. It was the feeling that something was watching him. Something out of place in the forest that he couldn't see or identify. He was a soldier, trained to handle danger, but this felt like something more. As he continued down the trail, Carter's eyes flicked to the trees around him. They were dense and dark, their trunks almost merging with the fog, creating an impenetrable wall of shadow. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if unseen eyes were following his every movement. He tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the area for any hint of movement. But there was nothing. No rustle in the leaves, no shifting branches, just that oppressive silence. He didn't like it, not one bit. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The uneasy feeling gnawed at him as he moved deeper into the forest. past the wreckage of broken branches and disturbed earth. Every step seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the forest was amplifying every sound he made. Carter's breath quickened as the fog thickened, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. Suddenly, there was another sound, a low growl. It was distant at first, but unmistakable, a warning. Carter's eyes snapped up, his heart hammering in his chest. That growl was not a sound he had ever heard from the animals around here. It was deep, guttural, something far more menacing. He took a cautious step back, his hand once again resting on the radio. But before he could speak, the sound came again, this time closer. His muscles tensed, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving in the direction he had just come from. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. Whatever had made those tracks, whatever had caused the disturbance in the forest, was nearby. He quickly scanned his surroundings, but all he could see through the fog was the dense thicket of trees and shadow. No movement, no sign of the creature. His training kicked in. Keep calm, assess the situation. He needed to get back to the base. Fast. He pivoted on his heel, moving swiftly but quietly, his senses stretched to their limit. Every crunch of leaves beneath his boots sounded like a shout in the silence. But he couldn't afford to be slow. He was too exposed. Whatever was in the forest with him, it wasn't showing itself, but it was there. He could feel it. A rustle came from behind him. Sharper now. Closer. He didn't look back. His heart raced. His breath shallow. His thoughts spun. What was out there? What had left those tracks? Those signs of disturbance? He had been through plenty of tense situations before. But this felt different. This felt wrong. The growls had stopped. But Carter knew he couldn't relax. Not until he was back at the base. Not until he was sure he was safe. Carter broke into a quick, steady pace, his rifle at the ready, eyes darting between the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. The fog closed in around him, the forest pressing in on all sides. And in the distance, there was the faintest sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Carter's pulse raced. This wasn't just a patrol anymore. This was survival. The silence was gone now, replaced by the sound of his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. The distant growl, and the haunting sense that whatever was out there had already made its presence known. Sergeant James Carter had never imagined that his routine patrol would lead him to something as disturbing as what he found that day. As he trudged deeper into the thick forest, the oppressive silence continued to press down on him. The fog had become denser, the mist clinging to the trees like a damp shroud. His boots sank into the soft earth, but every step seemed to take him farther from the familiar world he knew. He had seen plenty of strange things in his career, but nothing prepared him for what awaited just beyond the next stretch of trees. It was a small clearing, hardly noticeable unless you were looking for it. The air was still, and the silence was almost unnatural. The trees here stood like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching for each other, casting long shadows across the ground. As Carter moved cautiously forward, something caught his eye. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it, a large brown bear, chained to a tree. At first, Carter couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. Bears didn't live in this part of the forest, especially not in such a vulnerable state. The bear was massive, far larger than any he'd seen in his time stationed here. But its size was deceiving. It wasn't the proud, powerful creature one would expect to see roaming the woods. Instead, it was slumped against the tree, weak and exhausted, its once majestic fur matted and filthy. Its body appeared emaciated, the ribs clearly visible under the patches of discolored fur. The bear was chained tightly to the trunk, and a thick, cruel metal collar dug deeply into its neck, the jagged edges leaving raw, irritated marks around its throat. The sight was shocking. Carter's first instinct was to move forward. But something held him back. The bear's eyes locked with his. And in those deep, intelligent eyes, Carter saw something that made his stomach churn. It wasn't the wild, uncontrolled rage one might expect from a trapped animal. No, there was something far deeper, something more human in those eyes. The bear wasn't just an animal in distress, it seemed to understand its plight. It seemed to recognize Carter as more than just a threat or an intruder. The bear's gaze was pleading, its pain palpable. Carter felt a wave of responsibility wash over him, a sense of duty that was more than just the soldier's instinct to investigate and report. This bear, this helpless creature, was in a situation far beyond its control. It wasn't just trapped physically, it was broken in spirit. And somehow, Carter knew that he could not just walk away. The bear's suffering was too great. Its condition too dire for him to ignore. This wasn't just part of his patrol. This was something bigger, something that demanded action. His mind raced. What kind of person would chain a bear like this? Who would do such a thing? The more he looked at the creature, the more his thoughts spun. This wasn't just an unfortunate animal caught in a trap. It was evidence of something sinister. Someone had put this bear here, and they had done so with the intent to cause suffering. The chains, the collar, the marks of abuse all pointed to something far darker than a simple accident or misstep. Carter quickly pulled his notebook from his pocket and started taking detailed notes. Every broken branch, every torn piece of the bear's fur, every sign of struggle. He noted the size of the chains, the condition of the collar, and the way the bear's eyes seemed to follow him with an almost human awareness. His mind flicked back to his training, remembering the procedures for dealing with such discoveries. He couldn't just leave the animal here, but he also couldn't ignore the deeper implications of what was happening in this remote part of the forest. He pulled out his camera and began snapping photographs of the scene. The shots were methodical, capturing every angle, every detail. The images would be important later, to report the situation and gather the evidence necessary to help the bear. But for now, Carter had to focus. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him. The understanding that this discovery was far more significant than a routine patrol ever could be. As he took the last few photographs, his mind flashed to the larger questions at hand. Who had done this? Who would chain an animal like this? The bear wasn't wild. Its condition made that clear. It had been captured, restrained, and abandoned to suffer in the forest. The fact that the creature's eyes held that quiet intelligence only added to the horror. This was no mindless beast. This was a living creature, capable of understanding pain and fear. And yet it had been subjected to this cruel treatment. Carter's chest tightened as he realized the full scope of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just an isolated case. This could be part of something much larger, something darker lurking in the shadows of the forest. The bear shifted slightly, its chains rattling softly, but it didn't move toward Carter. It seemed to sense his hesitation, its eyes remaining locked on him with an almost sorrowful gaze. Carter felt a pang of guilt. What could he do to help it? He wasn't equipped for this kind of situation. He was a soldier, trained to fight and defend, not to care for animals in distress. But something about the bear's suffering made him want to do more. For a moment, Carter stood there, weighing his options. He knew he had to report this, that the discovery of such a situation needed immediate attention. But the more he looked at the bear, the more he realized he couldn't just leave it chained to the tree. It was in pain, and it deserved more than this. He could see it in its eyes. The bear was pleading for help, asking for something more than just pity. Without thinking further, Carter knelt down beside the bear, his hand resting briefly on the rough bark of the tree. He didn't know if the animal would respond, but he hoped his presence might offer a small amount of comfort. He spoke softly to it, his voice low and soothing, though he wasn't sure if the bear could even understand him. But he couldn't stand to see it like this anymore. "I'm going to get you out of here," he murmured, more to himself than the bear. "I promise. I'll get you the help you need." With that, he stood up, taking one last look at the bear before turning back toward the base. He had to act quickly. The chain and collar were heavy, and he couldn't leave the bear alone in its condition. But first he needed to get the right people involved. He knew this wasn't something he could handle alone. As he walked back toward the base, his thoughts were consumed by the discovery. The forest had always felt isolated, but now it seemed darker, more dangerous, and somewhere deep in the woods, someone was responsible for this cruelty. Carter was determined to find out who and bring him to justice, for the bear's sake, and for anyone else who might fall victim to whatever evil was lurking in the shadows. Sergeant James Carter's instincts were razor-sharp, honed over years of military service. When he left the clearing where the chained bear had been, those instincts drove him to follow the trail further, piecing together the scattered clues that seemed to be leading him somewhere. He knew that the bear wasn't an isolated case, that something darker was at play. As he made his way deeper into the woods, the eerie quiet that had once gripped the forest seemed to press in even harder. The trees, their branches still heavy with fog, appeared like sentinels in a ghostly silence. But Carter wasn't focused on the silence anymore. He was focused on finding answers. And the further he ventured into the forest, the more his sense of dread grew. It wasn't long before Carter stumbled upon a narrow, barely visible trail hidden beneath the thick brush and trees. The path was not natural, it had been carved by people. Carter's heart began to race as he carefully followed the trail, eyes scanning every corner of the forest, every broken branch, every footprint in the soft earth. His thoughts were focused, sharp, and filled with growing concern. He knew he was getting closer to something. But what exactly? He didn't know. The trail led him to a secluded spot deep in the woods. Hidden among the trees, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small camp. The camp was rudimentary, hastily thrown together, with a few tarps draped over tree branches and a fire pit that appeared to have been used recently. But what truly caught Carter's attention was the evidence scattered across the area. It didn't take long for him to realize that he had uncovered something truly disturbing. There were betting slips, their edges frayed and weathered, scattered on a wooden table in the center of the camp. The slips were covered with names and numbers, bets. Clearly, but not on anything typical. These were bets on animals. As Carter carefully examined them, he realized they were records of wagers placed on the fate of various creatures. The stakes weren't just about money, they were about lives of animals that were being exploited for sport, for profit, for some twisted form of entertainment. His eyes scanned the area further, landing on a stack of photographs that sent a chill through his spine. One of them was a clear image of the bear he had seen earlier, its once powerful body now weak and chained. A look of distress in its eyes. But the photo wasn't taken in the forest. It was taken in a circus. The setting was unmistakable. A brightly lit arena, a crowd in the background, and the bear at the center, performing some grotesque trick for the audience. It was clear now. This bear hadn't just been captured and abandoned, it had been part of an operation. Used as an attraction, subjected to the horrors of captivity and exploitation. Carter's hands clenched into fists as he realized the scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just one animal. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was a full-scale wildlife trafficking operation. Among the photographs were various documents, all detailing the illegal operation that stretched far beyond the borders of this forest. Maps, records, and logs filled with names, dates, and transactions made it clear that the trafficking ring was not a small-time operation. It spanned across regions, involved multiple locations, and targeted a variety of animals: bears, tigers, elephants, and more. The documentation showed how animals were captured, transported, and sold to the highest bidders, often to be used in circuses, private zoos, and even underground fighting rings. Carter felt a sickening knot form in his stomach. The bear wasn't the only victim. There were others, many others, and this camp was just a small piece of a much larger network of exploitation and suffering. His mind raced as he thought through the situation. The evidence before him was undeniable. This wasn't just a case of animal cruelty, it was organized crime. An operation that had been hidden away in the woods, away from prying eyes, but Carter knew that now that he had found it, he couldn't just walk away. This operation needed to be shut down, and the animals needed to be freed. But there was a complication. The bear, the one that had started this chain of discoveries, was still chained to that tree. Still suffering in the clearing. Carter's heart ached for it. It had endured so much already, and it couldn't stay there any longer. The weight of the decision hit him like a heavy stone. What could he do? He couldn't leave the bear in its current condition. But the operation was too big to tackle alone. He couldn't take down a criminal network by himself. He needed backup, and he needed it fast. Without a second thought, Carter pulled out his radio and contacted the base. He quickly relayed the information he had uncovered about the camp, the trafficking ring, and the bear's plight. He made sure to mention the urgency of the situation, how the bear couldn't be left behind, and how the operation needed to be handled before it could spread further. He requested reinforcements, specialists, and animal rescue teams to be dispatched immediately. The radio crackled to life with a response from his commanding officer. The message was clear. Backup was on the way. A rescue operation was set in motion. Carter's heart calmed, but just a little. He knew it would take time for reinforcements to arrive. And in the meantime, he couldn't sit idly by. He had to make sure the bear was safe, that no one else would find it before help could get there. He couldn't risk the animal being moved, hidden, or worse, destroyed before the authorities could act. As he made his way back to the clearing, Carter's mind was filled with a mix of determination and dread. He would not leave the bear behind. The camp might be the key to unraveling the entire wildlife trafficking ring. But the bear, the living creature, was his immediate responsibility. When he reached the clearing, he didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, positioning himself between the chained bear and any potential threats. The animal's eyes met his once again, and Carter could feel the weight of that gaze. The bear was tired, its suffering evident, but there was still something in those eyes that reminded him it wasn't lost. It wasn't completely broken. He knelt down beside it, his voice soft and reassuring. "Help is on the way," he whispered, even though he knew the bear couldn't understand. But somehow, saying it made him feel a little less helpless. He checked the chains one more time, making sure they were secure but not overly tight. Then settled into wait, knowing that time was both his enemy and his ally. The operation to rescue the bear and put an end to the trafficking ring was underway. But Carter knew it wouldn't be easy. The people behind this operation were dangerous, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Carter would not stop until the bear, and every other creature trapped in this nightmare, was freed. Sergeant James Carter stood by the clearing, the rain now coming down in steady sheets. The cold, wet droplets hit his face, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the bear, whose condition had weighed heavily on his mind ever since he'd found it chained to the tree. He had made sure to stay close, offering quiet words of reassurance to the animal, hoping his calm presence would keep it calm as well. The wildlife rescue teams and veterinarians had arrived, and now it was a matter of carefully and safely freeing the bear from its painful restraints. The professionals had been quick to set up a temporary triage area nearby, where they could assess the bear's health and prepare it for transport. Carter had given him the details of the situation, the chain, the collar, the bear's condition, and had even shown him the photographs and documents he had uncovered earlier. But as much as the experts were prepared to handle the medical side of things, Carter felt a deep responsibility to remain close to the animal. There was an unspoken connection between him and the bear, forged in the shared moment of suffering and the quiet promise that things would get better. Carter wasn't going to abandon that bond now, not when the bear needed him most. The rescue operation was anything but simple. The bear's chains were thick and heavy, designed not only to restrain but to cause pain and discomfort. The collar was made of rough metal, and it was so tight around the bear's neck that Carter could see the raw skin where it had been rubbing against the flesh. He could tell the veterinarians were working as fast as they could. But the rain and the sheer complexity of the task made everything more difficult. The bear was exhausted, weak from days, or perhaps weeks, of malnourishment, and it was showing signs of distress as the rescue workers moved around it. The wet ground made footing slippery, and the chains, thick with rust and grime, were not easy to cut or remove. Carter could see the frustration on the faces of the rescue team as they carefully worked, trying not to hurt the animal in the process. For hours, they toiled through the rain, carefully sawing through the chains, trying to loosen the collar around the bear's neck. Carter remained close, speaking softly to the bear, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. He told it that it was going to be okay, that it was finally free. He couldn't explain it to the bear, of course. It didn't understand human language. But Carter believed that the bear could sense his sincerity, his desire to help. Every time their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The bear wasn't just an animal anymore. It had become something more, something that Carter was determined to protect. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the chains were broken. The bear was free. The heavy metal links fell to the ground with a dull thud. And for a brief moment, there was a stillness in the air. The bear, though weak, seemed to understand that it was no longer bound. It shifted slightly, its legs trembling as it tried to stand. The effort was slow, and it wobbled at first, but it was clear that the bear was testing its newfound freedom, taking small, tentative steps away from the tree that had held it captive for so long. Carter stood by, watching with a mixture of awe and relief. The sight of the bear moving on its own, though unsteady, was a sign that it still had the will to live. That was more than Carter had hoped for. The animal had been through so much, physically, emotionally, and yet here it was, still willing to try, still holding on to the possibility of a better life. The veterinarians and rescue teams had their hands full now, carefully moving the bear to a transport cage that would take it to a sanctuary where it could receive the medical care it needed. But Carter refused to leave its side. As the team gently guided the bear toward the cage, Carter stayed close, speaking to it in low, comforting tones. He didn't know if the bear recognized him, but he hoped it did. After everything it had been through, Carter wanted it to know that it wasn't alone anymore. It had a chance at a new life, and he would make sure of it. The bear hesitated for a moment, its large body still trembling with weakness. But then it took another step forward. It paused for a moment, and Carter could see that it was looking at him, those deep, intelligent eyes locking onto his once again. He didn't say anything this time. He just stood there, offering silent reassurance, letting the animal know that it could trust him. The connection between them, though wordless, was stronger than anything Carter had felt in years. It was a bond forged in shared suffering and a mutual understanding of survival. As the bear was carefully loaded into the transport cage, Carter made sure to stay by its side. He gently patted the side of the cage, his voice soft and steady. "You're going to be okay now," he said. "You've made it. You're free." There was a quiet sadness in his heart, knowing that the journey ahead for the bear was still a long one. The road to recovery would be difficult, and there was no guarantee that the bear would ever fully heal from the trauma it had endured. But Carter knew this was a start. The bear had been given a chance to heal, to be free of the chains that had once held it captive. As the rescue team closed the cage and prepared for transport, Carter took one last look at the bear. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in what seemed like forever, there was hope. The bear, once a prisoner of cruelty, was now on its way to a place where it could rest, recover, and perhaps one day return to the wild. Carter could only hope that it would find peace in the years to come. But there was more work to do. The trafficking ring that had caused so much pain for this bear and countless other animals still needed to be dismantled. The evidence that Carter had uncovered would help bring those responsible to justice. But the fight wasn't over. He had seen firsthand what this operation had done, and he was determined to make sure that no more animals would suffer at the hands of those who profited from their pain. As the transport vehicle pulled away, Carter stood in the rain, watching it disappear into the distance. He didn't need to say anything more. The bear had trusted him in its moment of need, and Carter had kept his promise. It was free, and that was enough. After the harrowing ordeal in the forest, Atlas, the bear once bound by cruel chains, was transported to a wildlife sanctuary, where it would begin the long, difficult journey of recovery. The sanctuary was a world apart from the harsh, confined space where Atlas had spent so much of its life in captivity. Here, Atlas was surrounded by wide open spaces, towering trees, and the sounds of other animals, offering a chance to heal in ways that no sterile, isolated cage could ever provide. The caregivers at the sanctuary were experts in rehabilitating animals that had suffered trauma, and they wasted no time assessing Atlas's condition and setting up a comprehensive care plan. The bear, though physically frail and emaciated, was alive, and that was a victory in itself. The initial weeks were focused on regaining its strength. Atlas had been malnourished, dehydrated, and emotionally scarred. Its fur was matted and tangled, its eyes tired and wary. But the staff at the sanctuary were patient. They knew that true recovery would take time, and they were prepared to offer Atlas all the time it needed. Slowly but surely, the bear began to regain its health. The staff fed it specially formulated meals designed to rebuild its strength, and they administered treatments for the wounds around its neck caused by the tight collar. Over time, Atlas began to show signs of improvement. The once dull eyes began to sparkle with life again, and its movements became less sluggish, more purposeful. It started to explore the sanctuary's grounds, taking slow, cautious steps at first, but gradually becoming more confident as it realized that it was no longer confined. The bear's behavior began to shift as well. It was clear that Atlas was not the same animal it had been when it had first arrived. In its early days at the sanctuary, it had been distant and wary, understandably frightened by humans due to the abuse it had endured. But with each passing day, the bond between Atlas and the sanctuary staff grew. The bear started to trust again, responding to their voices, their presence, even accepting small touches of affection. It was as though the walls that had been built around it during its captivity were slowly crumbling. For Sergeant James Carter, the connection with Atlas didn't end when the bear was taken to the sanctuary. From the moment Carter had discovered the chained animal in the woods, he had felt a deep sense of responsibility for its well-being. He had promised the bear that it would be freed. And he had kept that promise. But his connection to Atlas didn't fade after the rescue, it only grew stronger. Carter continued to visit the sanctuary regularly, watching Atlas's transformation with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Each visit was a reminder of the incredible resilience of the bear, who had endured so much pain and suffering, yet was still fighting to reclaim its life. As the months passed, Atlas's progress became more and more evident. The bear's coat began to grow back, thick and glossy, and its body filled out as it regained weight. Its movements grew more fluid, no longer slow and labored, but instead purposeful and strong. It had become more independent as well, spending time exploring its environment, climbing trees, and playing in the sanctuary's large enclosures. Atlas was no longer the weak, frightened creature Carter had first encountered. It was a thriving, powerful animal once again, free from the chains that had held it captive for so long. But Carter's visits to the sanctuary were not just about witnessing Atlas's recovery. They were also about the larger impact of the bear's story. The investigation into the wildlife trafficking ring that had been uncovered by Carter's discovery in the forest had grown into a full-scale operation. The authorities had acted swiftly, using the evidence Carter had collected at the hidden camp to track down the criminals responsible for the trafficking. As a result, several arrests were made, and law enforcement had begun dismantling the illegal network that had been responsible for exploiting Atlas and countless other animals. The story of Atlas's rescue spread, sparking public outrage over wildlife trafficking and raising awareness about the need for greater protection of endangered species. Carter had always known that the bear's suffering was just one small part of a much larger issue. The illegal wildlife trade had been flourishing for years, exploiting animals for profit and entertainment, leaving devastation in its wake. But the rescue of Atlas had given the issue a face. An animal that had endured unimaginable cruelty but was now on the path to healing. It was a powerful story, one that had captured the attention of people around the world and sparked action. Carter couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in knowing that his role in Atlas's rescue had led to such significant changes. The trafficking ring was being dismantled, arrests were being made, and the fight to protect animals was gaining traction. It was a reminder that even small actions, even the efforts of one soldier in a remote forest, could have a lasting impact. Eventually, the day came when Carter's visits to the sanctuary became less frequent. He had been transferred to another assignment, and his time with Atlas was drawing to a close. As he walked through the sanctuary one final time, making his way toward the area where Atlas now roamed freely, Carter felt a sense of bittersweet pride. The bear he had first found in such a tragic state was no longer a victim. It had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of recovery, and a living reminder of the importance of protecting wildlife. When Carter reached the area where Atlas was, the bear was lounging in the sun, its massive form resting peacefully against the thick grass. It had grown stronger, and its once wary eyes now sparkled with trust. Carter approached slowly, mindful of the bond they had built. He wasn't sure if the bear recognized him anymore, but he wasn't concerned. Atlas had healed, and it was thriving in a place that would provide it with the safety and care it deserved. Standing there, watching the bear, Carter reflected on the journey they had both been on. The pain, the trauma, the rescue, the recovery, it had all led to this moment. Where Atlas was free, the bear had found its new home, one that would offer it the peace and freedom it had long been denied. And in doing so, Atlas had become more than just a symbol of the fight against wildlife trafficking. It had become a living, breathing example of the resilience that exists in both animals and humans. A reminder that, even after suffering unimaginable hardship, there is always the possibility of healing, growth, and hope. As Carter turned to leave the sanctuary that day, he knew that Atlas's story was far from over. It would continue to inspire, to remind others of the importance of compassion, and to fuel the fight for animal rights and wildlife protection. Atlas had been freed from its chains, but its legacy, one of survival, strength, and resilience, would live on for years to come.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.